Welcome to the Cannabis Subcommittee meeting, and it is Tuesday, December 13th. I call the meeting to order, and I'll have roll call starting on the left.
June Gagny.
Carla Desjardins.
Raj Shiver.
Brian.
Right. And we do have a quorum. There are no alternates to appoint. So we're continuing the discussion regarding cannabis regulations. So when we last met, staff had compiled some examples of other towns and information. They had also drafted two versions of regulations, one which would prohibit the use, and then one which would regulate the use. So the first question we have to determine is, do we want to allow the use? If so, then we don't have to worry about the prohibition language. We would just be looking at the regulation language. So for discussion of members, is there a direction that we wanted to go into this evening?
Well, it's built on. It's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should do it.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm certainly not sure because we have a list of towns as examples that allow permission, but they have regulations, and then we have the ones that banned it. We don't have any examples like from other states how it's been known for them to have retail operations in their towns.
So what you want is examples from other states that it's been in
that
operation?
they've had retail or cultivation for a while. They've been, it seems like some of these towns agree to having it grown in town, and they have regulations for that. There aren't as many retail operations. I was wondering why we didn't have anything from Montville. I know they have a dispensary there, and I was wondering what Montville did with their regulations.
Ryan, as part of staff review, was Montville included?
Not that I'm aware of, but Montville has a medical dispensary.
Right.
Which would be a different purpose because the medical, you have to have a prescription. So it's not really open to the public. You can't just walk in. You got to have a prescription. So this would be recreation. So this would be open to...
Right, and it's almost like a liquor store. So what I was wondering is, most of the regulations say that the retail operations can't be near, well, also cultivation, but they can't be near churches and schools, and public buildings, public municipal buildings. And I'm wondering, why is it along the same criteria as liquor stores?
Yeah, they pretty much follow the same regulations that liquor stores follow. And that's all per town too, that's not a state statute.
No.
So in the draft that we have, section 12.47.1, the setback requirements, that's where it talks about, yep, it's page 3 of the draft proposed amendment. So item A, it does say, no cannabis production or dispensing facility shall be located within 1,000 feet of any municipal building, playground, public park, public recreation area, recreation center or facility, licensed adult or child daycare center, dependency treatment center, place of worship, nursery, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, elementary, secondary school, whether supported by public or private funds, library, charitable institution, hospital, veterans home, military establishments, which are in existence as of the date for the special permit. So that limits location.
Well, that's why I was wondering, because it makes it sound like it's something bad.
But
Just
if you're thinking about, but I think the idea with the regulation is, would you want a retail operation right next to a school?
Right, I know what you're saying, but is it?
Because if we think about some of the commercial properties, some of them are right next to schools. So, but that's why we're drafting this,
Right.
that's why we're discussing it.
And I'm asking, does it leave many places left? I mean, I know there's a place on Route 12 where they had wanted to put a dispensary from Montville, but we didn't have any regulations yet.
Weren't they looking at the old drugstore down here at one time for a dispensary across the street from Landmark?
Don't recall that. I know they were looking at the old A&P.
Oh, really?
Okay, in Central Village?
Yeah, that was back during medical marijuana.
Okay.
That was in the-
So I guess what I hear you asking is, would staff get a map of Plainfield and then using these landmarks, create 1,000 foot to identify where would it be allowed and where would it not be allowed? Is that something staff could do before our next meeting in January?
Yep.
Okay, so request one from staff is a map of Plainfield using the draft regulations. Determine which areas are outside that 1,000 foot. Okay.
And there's still in zoning, right?
Correct,
You had certain zoning.
correct.
Commercial, industrial, one, was it?
Well, it'd be based on the use. So if it was a retail operation, it would have to be within a commercial zone.
Right, and if it was a grow place, facility, it could be in,
I believe that was limited to, was it RA 60 and industrial? Hold on. All right, so if you look at section 12.47.2, hours of operation in zoning districts, item B, zoning districts, it indicates cannabis facilities are permitted by special permit in the commercial and industrial zones. Cannabis facilities shall be strictly prohibited in all residential zones, highway, commercial, industrial, park, and planned development districts. And then it does have a note that pursuant to Connecticut General Statute, Section 8-6, as amended by Public Act 77-509, Town of Plainfield Zoning Board of Appeals is prohibited from granting any variance which would permit any of the foregoing uses to be established, enlarged, extended, or intensified in any zone district within which uses are prohibited. So this would be strictly to commercial and industrial zones.
and the other question that I developed was, has anyone, I know you talked to the fire department about some of the grow facilities or the production, I'm thinking about production. There's something involved with CO2, some kind of element that's used in producing certain edibles.
I have not spoken with them.
Okay, you haven't, and I was wondering about the police department. They handle street drugs, so have they been queried about it?
I don't know if Mary Ann contacted them or not.
Okay.
So Kevin's in the audience, and Kevin and I were part of a meeting with the police department, because in here it does indicate security planned. So what is your more specific question about what police involvement would need to be besides security?
Well, how they would feel about it, because they deal with street drugs all the time. And up until this time, it's always been a street drug. So how do they feel about having
I don't know that,
monitoring?
well, but the legalization part is not in our purview. That is already done.
Yeah, right.
So as far as the police are concerned, it's been legalized by the state of Connecticut. I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, so please. I don't believe they reflected an opinion on whether or not we should have them. It was just ensuring that they follow the rules, the regs, to stay within the law.
Okay. So
Yeah, so they're not in the business of giving an opinion on the law. They are there to enforce the law. All right, thank you, Kevin. Kevin's just nodding in agreement for the record.
and the revenue, we can't discuss whether, because my understanding is the town can receive revenue from the sales, and that must be used to, it can be used for other things, not just,
So as a land use board, we cannot use the profitability or the tax revenue of any industry to determine whether or not we should zone something or regulate something. We have to look at our plan of conservation and development, and is it a good land use in the town? Does it fit with the plan of conservation and development?
it does allow the money can be used for improvements in the town.
Right, but that would be to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance to do. That is not within our jurisdiction to make a judgment on. So for our purposes, the financial impact is not one of the criteria that we use to determine whether we should allow or prohibit something.
That was my only questions.
Okay.
I'm not sure yet.
Now, the sale of it, that wouldn't be taxed money to go to the town?
So it's a retail operation.
No.
So they would have to pay the same business taxes that any other business would have to pay. There's some kind of profit sharing, but once again, that's not within our purview. So essentially, it's irrelevant to our determination of whether we should allow or prohibit. It's not a consideration, it's not a factor. We are a land use board, we are not an economic development commission, and we are not the Board of Finance or Board of Selectmen who, you know, whether they're endorsing a company coming to town, that's something that would be their purview, not ours. We are strictly about the land use, the zoning, the regulation of it.
Okay, so there's another committee out there working on the other things, the taxes and all, as far as,
Do you want to speak to, Kevin, what the Economic Development Commission does when they review whether they endorse a business coming to town, or how Board of Selectmen would review tax revenue in the budget?
Separate from the land use issues, we would talk about the financial impact. Also, we'd be talking with the police as well, because we want to make sure that they have support in case we do approve them move forward on this, because it's one more thing that adds onto their plate of what they have to be following and discussing. If you want to just read on it, so you know what it is, it's section 12-330 and that will give you an idea of what the revenue can be used for. And I know I heard mention of looking at other states. I don't think that would be appropriate in this case, other than the operations and how they're done. But every state's different. So every state statute has different statutes about what they do. In the case of that one, in particular, 12-330 just so you know, there's only 6 uses for the money, that 3% tax revenue. And there's only 6 uses, and most of them are education. The only one you can use it for in this case is for upgrade of the area around for which the facility is either doing the growing or the sale of. And there is no other issues like, and I can give an example of it just so you really get the background to it. The example would be Massachusetts, who came through and they were the first ones to come in. Massachusetts utilizes almost the same thing as the 3% rule, but they also allowed for a hometown rule. So the first 2 distribution companies, if you would, that came through was in Northampton, Mass. And Leicester, Mass. And they had hometown agreements, of which they made a lot of money on. But I would put an asterisk beside that, because making money on tax revenue to what you have to do for offset is the fact that they had some major issues with traffic control, so they had to hire extra police, and they had major issues with parking for getting these people to and from. So the offset monies that they were getting from revenue for their hometown agreement was to curb the issues with crowd control and parking and things like that. So in the state of Connecticut, just to give you an idea, they don't have that hometown agreement. That's not in it.
they don't have it?
Nope.
Can you do it? Can
Nope.
you use it?
Nope, you have to follow the statutes.
Prohibited.
It prohibits it from doing that. So, again, your board is not related to the money issue, but I just wanted you to know if you wanted to take a look at it and see. I mean, I have an opinion about it. My opinion is it's not worth the 3% revenue to then put it into only the neighborhood which that position is going to be, and then you can't get anything else out of it. If they had laxed the use of the 3%, then maybe, because then you could use the money for something else within your town. So I'm just giving my opinion about it. I do appreciate the time to discuss that.
Thank you. So, once again, considering the regulations, having staff map out Plainfield to see where would it be located, where would it be allowed. So that'll give an idea of how many establishments, what the possible availability of location would be. Because once again, it's also restricted to state roadways, so it would not be on town roadways. And once again, the main question we have to review is, do we prohibit? So the first draft document was a prohibition. So it would say that cannabis uses as authorized by Section 148B of June Special Session, Public Act 21-1, all cannabis establishments as defined in Section 1, subsection 4 are prohibited and may not be established in the town of Plainfield. So there's three routes we can go. Route number 1, we do nothing, and cannabis operations would be allowed in retail operations by right as commercial zones, right, Ryan?
Correct.
So if we do nothing, then they are allowed without additional regulation, except what the state says. Option 2 is prohibition. Now, Ryan, am I right that we could break out production versus retail?
Absolutely.
So if the commission felt it better to prohibit retail but allow production, or allow production and prohibit retail, we also have that option.
Yes, you do.
Okay. So if that were the case, once again, we would still have to develop regulations for what we are allowing, because the regulations would ensure that it wouldn't be allowed by right in any commercial location or any industrial location. So you'd have a more limiting ability. So those are the branches, and that's why the subcommittee was formed, to work out these issues. So what it sounds like to me is that the subcommittee is not ready to determine whether it should be prohibition, regulation, or partial prohibition, partial regulation. Is that?
My thought is partial. Growing, that's where I'm leaning right now, but
I didn't do that.
I'm for production in way of growing, but not producing edibles. That's another one too, right?
So we wouldn't be able to limit what product, so if we allow a retail operation, it would be whatever product they produce. So we could not tell them, you cannot produce edibles here. Am I right about that? Because that's not a land use. That is,
I think that's crossing the line.
yeah.
Okay.
So you
Which
could,
is farming, I'm thinking farms.
so what you're saying is you would be more in favor of allowing the growing production of it, but not the sale of it.
Right.
Okay.
But that's open, I mean, that can be changed, right? That can be changed later on.
Sure, you can always modify the regulations.
Right, it seems like that's the case.
Either way. Right.
And we do currently have a moratorium. So if the commission needs additional time to determine, and then we can extend the moratorium to continue discussion and development.
Tell me why you don't want to grow it.
No, growing, fine.
growing.
Yeah, retail, I'm not sure how that will be.
Are you worried about traffic?
Right,
Traffic
traffic.
impact? So I think when we have a map determining what locations are available, that would give us a better idea of what traffic flow would be, and parking and that kind of thing.
It would attract a lot of traffic. My guess, I mean, I don't know how the other, we don't have a lot of examples, right?
Well, it's like shiny new toy, right? I mean, if Plainfield was the first, then yeah, probably all of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and, not Massachusetts, they already have it. I don't think Rhode Island has it yet.
No.
Oh, they do? All right, so Rhode Island.
Really?
So, but anybody in Connecticut that's closer to Plainfield than any state that it's legal, sure, it's going to attract, but that's clairvoyant predictive skills I do not have.
My primary concern would be odor from production.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Outdoor grow operations, I think we should prohibit those because that can really be a nuisance to the area. I don't think a whole lot of people want to do outdoor grow anyway because you cannot control the
Of the
environment.
security,
Well, the security, but
weather.
yes, weather is a big thing. You only have, a limited grow season outdoors. So most people, if they're going to invest money, do it indoors. Indoors, you can control the odor as long as it's done with proper filtration. And it'd be important to regulate that so that they do have the proper filtration.
That's something we can regulate.
Yes, yes.
So I don't see, and point me in the right direction, Ryan, if I'm missing it, but I don't see in the current draft where it differentiates between indoor and outdoor facilities.
We can design that into it.
Okay, so part 2 for our next meeting would be to include differentiation between outdoor and indoor growing. With language to prohibit outdoor production. Because it seems like that seems to be a consensus.
Do that, you could prohibit that.
Yeah,
We could allow
yeah.
production.
We could tell them it must all be inside the building.
Yeah, because I was thinking a lot of these elements are close together. RA 16.
So it wouldn't be allowed in RA 16.
Yeah.
It would be allowed in commercial and
But that's what
industrial
I'm saying.
only.
Yeah, those border sometimes, they border commercial or industrial zone.
So in looking at the draft regulation, are there additional items that you'd want to see separated out in the event that the commission determined to prohibit one use but allow the other use? So if we prohibited retail but allowed production, when you look at the regulations determining what the limits are on the production, are there items you would want to see included or excluded in that? It's all by special permit. So everything requires public hearing.
Actually, it says traffic control would have to be, if you had a retail, you know, each application would have to go over the traffic.
Correct.
Or is it a walk before your one scenario? Do the growing and then go to the future.
Kevin?
I mean, I'm not saying that.
I just want to make possible suggestions for the next meeting. You have some towns that have started the process and some said, no, we don't want anything at all. Some say we are allowing certain things. I think it might be prudent to reach out to those towns for a P&Z talk discussion between P&Z chairs or those people who help to put the regulations together. Because it could give you an idea of why they said no, and it could give you an idea of why they said yes. The other one I would suggest is the one in Western Massachusetts, to reach out to their P&Z because they do have an indoor grow. And they might help you with some of the zoning regulations for that particular issue, because I know they went through that already. It was an old warehouse that they purchased and then started an indoor grow session in there.
Have any towns approved facilities?
Yes, Illinois has one that's approved. I'm not aware of any others in the area.
Okay.
Thompson, North Groveland.
So did Killingly, I didn't see Killingly in here. Was Killingly in here?
They weren't in there.
They're new, they're brand new.
Yeah, they were approved a month or two ago.
Oh, okay. So Killingly has approved regulations and they already have an approved application.
Yes.
Okay. So is that, have they already started building that facility?
So the facility is actually an old bank. It's in the Coles Plaza.
Oh, okay. Got it. For next month, could you include the Killingly regs and their application if they set any conditions on that approval?
Yeah.
And what is the expiration of our moratorium? Do you remember that date?
6 months, 2 months.
I believe we are in the second month.
Okay. Because I just want to keep an eye on the expiration date, because if we need to extend it, if we do a 3-month extension or whatever, just to make sure, you know. Because yes, we can amend regulations, but I wouldn't want to just shove regulations out there. So I would rather
Keep it on campus.
take our time to
Yeah.
have the regulations developed. Kevin, from a Board of Selectmen perspective, was there ever any discussion about an advisory question to the townspeople? Okay. Is that something that the Board of Selectmen would review? I think Ballintown did an advisory question.
But we could do an advisory question or other questions, but that would require us to go back out to a referendum for those questions. So there's a cost associated to that.
Sure. And then, obviously not doing a special referendum, but if it was included as a regular ballot initiative, that wouldn't be till November of next year. Or if there was a primary. Can you allow ballot questions on a primary
I don't
election?
know if they do or not, so I have to look that up too.
Okay, all right. And once again, anything we propose is subject to public hearing, so the public would have the opportunity to weigh in. So if we proposed a prohibition regulation and there was, immense public support or opposition, then that can guide the board's, the public input can also guide the board's decision. All right. Are there any other items to discuss this evening? As we've already made a list for our next meeting. Okay. So hearing no other points or items of discussion, I'll entertain a motion to close the subcommittee meeting.
Is there public input?
There is not at this meeting, it's just a subcommittee. And actually, so closing the discussion part, moving on to acting on our minutes from the previous meeting. I'm not sure that I saw them.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Carla, did you motion to close or did you just close?
No, I was inquiring if they wanted to close.
Oh, okay.
Yes, did you have another item?
No, so we are closing that item or what?
I believe there's no further discussion, so I'm moving to reviewing and acting on the minutes. Are there any changes, adjustments, modifications to the minutes?
I didn't see anything.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion on the minutes.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
All right, I have a motion. You can still approve the minutes.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not required.
all right.
All right, so I have a motion to accept the minutes and a second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Meeting minutes are approved. There's nothing under other, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the subcommittee meeting.
I'll make that motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Second by Ralph. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Meeting is adjourned. Couple minutes. My microphones put on. Thank you. Am I not plugged in? Okay. we get microphones online, we'll get going. Thank you. All right, are we ready? Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, Tuesday, December 13th. I'll call it to order and ask for roll call, starting on the left.
June Gagney.
John Meyer.
Carla Desjardins.
Raj Shivik.
Brian Bright.
Katie. All right, so we do have a quorum. There are no alternates to appoint. So coming into our public hearings, item A, 22-8ZC of 55 East Main LLC, care of William R. Sweeney Esquire, requesting a text amendment to section 7.21.1, 7.22.1, 7.23.1, 7.24.1, 8.21, and adding new section 12.47 for the purpose of allowing for multi-family housing. Do we have someone to speak for the applicant?
Yes, Madam Chairwoman.
All right, proceed.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Bill Sweeney. I'm a partner and a land use attorney with the law firm of Tobin Carberry in London, Connecticut. And it's a pleasure to be here before you once again. I appear tonight on behalf of 55 East Main Street LLC, which is a Connecticut limited liability company and a property owner here in Plainfield. Joining me tonight is Paul Provost. Paul is a principal of my client. As the chairwoman read in the call, this is an application seeking modification to sections 7.211, 7.221, 7.231, 7.241, and 8.21 of your zoning regulations, as well as an addition of a new section 12.47. Together, these amendments are intended to expand, diversify, and enhance opportunities for multifamily residence development here in the town of Plainfield within various zoning districts by special permit approval. I would remind the Commission that tonight you sit in your legislative capacity and that this is a zoning text amendment application, unlike a site plan or a special permit. It's not associated with any specific project or any specific property, but this is a change of the zoning regulations which is of general applicability. In other words, what we're trying to do tonight is modify the regulations to give developers and property owners new opportunities to propose multifamily residential development in Plainfield. And if this application is approved, an applicant, a developer, a property owner would still have to come back before this commission with a specific site plan for your review so that you can ensure that the project not only meets the requirements that we're setting forth in this change, but is also compatible with the surrounding community. Over the last few months, we've worked really closely with Ryan Brace on this proposal. Certainly appreciated the input that he provided to it, and we've incorporated many of his comments. I was here last month for the receipt of the application, and at that time I talked just very briefly about some of the changes that are going on in Eastern Connecticut. And the demographics of Eastern Connecticut, like much of our state and our country, are changing, and they're changing rapidly. The prominence of what is the so-called nuclear family, mom and dad and 2.5 kids in a single-family owner-occupied house with a white picket fence, those days are really over as the norm, at least. Towns and cities across the country, and particularly in Eastern Connecticut, are seeing a strong demand for a variety of non-traditional living arrangements, and that span a whole variety of different socioeconomic groups as well as generations. Younger people are far more transient than they've ever been in American history. They're putting off children later into life, and they're looking to live in close proximity to the places they work and they play. Older folks are looking to downsize, they're looking to limit their expenses, but they still want to stay in the communities where they grew up in, where they raised families, and where they have those connections. And perhaps most Importantly for Plainfield, new workers are coming into the area looking for quality, attainably priced housing with modern convenience. And this is important, substantial amenity packages, things like fitness centers, on-site storage, in-home offices, community rooms, and indoor and outdoor recreation opportunities. Now, these are major changes to a lot of the historic development patterns we've seen in Eastern Connecticut. And many communities are being forced to look at their zoning regulations to try to accommodate these new demographic and housing trends. Ultimately, there is demand now in Eastern Connecticut for quality, market-rate multifamily residences. I also am aware that Plainfield's been at the forefront of a lot of economic development activity over the last few years, and I know this commission has been instrumental in welcoming the arrival of several new employers into the region. As a result, this existing demand for new multifamily is only going to increase exponentially as many of these new employers come online over the next few years. Towns in the area are going to have the opportunity to capitalize on these new investment in the area by providing housing opportunity for the workers that are coming. And towns realize that they want to have these workers living in their communities because with these workers they come their disposable income that are spent in your supermarkets, in your local restaurants, in the local businesses, and helps improve the overall local economy. You certainly don't want people working here and then living in other towns. Studies by a lot of leading universities, including Rutgers, if you're familiar with some of their work, has shown that multifamily housing has a positive impact on local finances, as the taxes these projects pay outweigh the costs of additional services, including education. Currently, as you're aware, housing in Plainfield remains dominated by an aging housing stock, primarily of single-family owner-occupied homes. And that's not uncommon for Eastern Connecticut. There are provisions right now in your zoning regulations that allow some multifamily development, but it's often at densities that are impractical for investment or from practical development standards. So the amendments that we're seeking tonight would add multifamily residential development as special permit uses to your RA60, to your R40, to your R30, to your R19, and to your commercial zoning districts, subject to strict requirements laid out in the new section 12.47. I'm going to go through that regulation with you in a second, but just in summary and a sort of an overview, these requirements include, and I think these are the high points, there's no explicit density allowances for this housing. There is, however, a minimum lot area of 10 acres to be eligible for a project. There must be minimum frontage on a state highway. The project needs to be serviced by public water and public sewer. It must have underground utilities. The maximum building height for these projects is 3 stories, 3 residential stories. There is parking standards provided, but they are flexible to allow for a variety of different sites and different types of housing designs. There is required recreation and open space set-asides in these new regulations. There are setbacks and buffers to adjacent properties. And at the request of Mr. Bryce, there's also some defined architectural standards as well. From our perspective, these amendments allow us to respond, allow the town, quite frankly, to respond to the current demand for multifamily housing, but they also honor the goals and objectives of your plan of conservation and development, which is part of your job in reviewing a text amendment. And in that, these changes encourage the expansion and the diversification of housing opportunities for all different types of residents with all different needs in the community. So I'm going to go through the actual language of the text amendment at this time, and I think you have copies of it. You're free to follow along with me. Under section 7.21, 722, 723, 724, and 8.2, you'll see that what we've done is basically added multifamily residence development as enumerated special permit uses. So all those changes in all those sections just add this idea of multifamily residence development as a special permit use. And each of those citations then refers to section 12.47, which adds the additional eligibility and conditional requirements. So I'm going to really just try to focus on 12.47 because I think that's really what the meat of the proposal is about tonight. So 12.47, multifamily residence development, says that a multifamily residence development shall consist of one or more buildings containing multifamily residences on a single lot and shall be permitted by special permit in specified districts, provided the following standards are satisfied. So these are the minimum requirements that are required for someone to come before you and make a proposal under your special permit, the guidelines and requirements for one of these projects. And the first is, under subsection A, that there must be a minimum lot area of 10 acres. The reason for this is we believe that there needs to be a critical mass. We don't want people doing multifamily projects on a quarter-acre lot. The idea is there should be a minimum critical mass of land, and we think 10 acres is sufficient. One, it gives you enough room to do a project that has some substantially positive impact for the community. Two, it gives you enough room to actually provide buffers and separation to surrounding land uses. And maybe three, and maybe most importantly, it limits how many lots in the town are actually eligible. Now you can always combine lots to get to the 10 acres, but 10-acre lots are fairly large lots. They're more than even medium-sized lots. There is only a select number of 10-acre lots or greater in the town. So what it just basically says is we're looking at larger parcels of land for this development. It's also important to note that while we have a 10-acre minimum lot size, we don't have a density requirement. Many older zoning regulations you'll see will have 1 unit per 5,000 square feet, or 1 unit per 3,000 square feet of lot area. That's a very traditional way of doing multifamily residence development. Many towns are moving away from those sort of arbitrary density requirements, rather saying, come forward on a piece of property that's eligible and show us the units that you're proposing, and show us that you can meet the carrying capacity of that site with those number of units. So this regulation does not have any limit on how many units you can do per acre, but it does have limits, for instance, on recreation area, on parking, on setbacks, and that sort of backs you into the number of units you might be able to propose on a property. We think that that's a more modern and efficient way of controlling density. The second control that's in 1247 is under subsection B. It says the lot shall have frontage on and primary access to and from a state highway via at least a 40-foot minimum width access strip. The drive must be bituminous concrete and capable of accommodating two-way traffic, vehicle traffic, including fire apparatus and emergency vehicles. We did not want to make every 10-acre parcel in the specified zones eligible for multifamily development. We wanted to make sure that that development was targeted where there was infrastructure in place in town to support it, particularly traffic infrastructure. So by making it requiring the parcel to have frontage or access to a state highway, you make sure that the cars being generated from the project and traveling to and from the project have adequate state highways to support them. We also have, for emergency and fire protection, make sure that we have adequate access in and out of the development to that state highway. So if you can think for a second in your mind, if you can imagine a map of all the parcels in the town of Plainfield, the first provision eliminates everything that's under 10 acres in size. Now eliminate everything that doesn't have frontage or direct access to a state highway. We've looked at it internally in our group, and we're talking about a couple dozen parcels that even meet this requirement at this point. So it's a fairly small universe based on just those two requirements. We could go on though. We also, in subsection C, put the requirement that you must have municipal sewer and public water service to the parcel. We don't want to get into a situation where we have wells and septic systems. Now, wells and septic systems are often used for multifamily development. But what our feeling is that this ensures that you're not going to have issues with septic systems, or failing septic systems, or wells that go dry. Make sure that you have consistent and reliable sewer and water service to the project. So again, think of that map that I asked you to imagine. It's all parcels greater than 10 acres. They have to be on a state highway, and they have to have water and sewer service. Again, sort of the universe of potential locations decreases as a result of these requirements. D, which is the next subsection in 1247, requires all utility lines to be underground. This is required for most modern developments. We really want to make sure from an aesthetic standpoint that we don't have power lines running into the project. It should be underground. We're trying to build quality, market rate housing in town, and so we want to make sure that it has the aesthetic appearance that really complements the community. Subsection E under 1247, notwithstanding the maximum height provisions of the underlying zoning district, no building shall exceed 3 stories exclusive of ground level or subsurface parking. We thought three-story multifamily allows for things like townhomes. It allows for smaller garden apartments. We don't think things like high-rises, which might be appropriate for places like New London or New Haven, are appropriate in Plainfield. So we want to keep them lower in terms of their overall building mass and their size. But we also want to encourage people to do creative things with their parking. We want to encourage developers to have parking built into their buildings. One, covered parking increases the value of properties. It's safer for residents, but it also eliminates unnecessary impervious surface. Now, I know you do look at stormwater as part of your review of site plans and special permits, but if you can get parking under a building, that's less paved parking lot that we have to deal with from a stormwater perspective, and less paved runoff that we have to deal with from an environmental perspective as well, and you have to worry about. So we think that that's that allows for flexibility, encouraging good building design. Under subsection F, it says, notwithstanding any provision of section 13.3, paved off-street parking shall be provided at a rate of 1 space per studio or 1 bedroom dwelling unit and 2 spaces per 2 or more bedroom dwelling unit. It also goes on to say that the commission may permit the construction of any portion of the required parking spaces to be deferred until such time the commission deems necessary, provided that a bond in a form acceptable to the commission is submitted covering the costs of such deferred parking spaces. So let me break this into two sections for discussion. The first section is we set a parking standard for these multifamily developments. This is the parking standard that was in the latest state legislation for multifamily residential development. I've done a lot of multifamily development over the last 20 years, particularly down in the southeast corner of the state. As I said, demographics are changing, people's use of cars are changing. The days when every apartment gets 2 parking spaces, those days are over. That there really isn't that need to pave extensive parking lots to support multifamily units. We think 1 per space for studio and 1 bedroom and 2 spaces per 2 or more bedroom unit is more than sufficient to give reasonable parking on a unit basis. That being said, it doesn't prevent an applicant from providing more spaces if they wish, but that's the minimum that they have to provide. We also have included this deferral language, and this was something that came up talking with Mr. Brace, is there are certain types of multifamily that have even lower parking demand. For example, elderly housing or housing with people with disabilities. I'm working on a project downstate right now, people that have cerebral palsy, people that have autism spectrum disorder, multifamily housing. Some of these people don't have cars and don't drive. What this section does is allows for, on a case-by-case basis, for the commission to determine whether or not you need to build all the parking up front. So you might do the calculations based on the number of bedrooms and realize a project needs 100 spaces. The developer might say, listen, I think we can get by with 50 and be more than sufficient. You can approve them to just build 50 up front. And if that's all they need at the end of the day, if it proves true, that's fine. But if you can defer the other 50, and the commission can say, look at it and be, hey, you're right, you didn't need to build those, you can keep those unbuilt. Or maybe just by looking at it, you can see, hey, they're full every day. You can request the applicant then to go forward and build it. So I think this is the kind of flexibility that I think the developers are looking for. I think it's a sort of a creative approach to deferring parking, and it's included in our regulation. Again, I think it's an interesting provision that I think is worthy of your consideration. Moving on, section G, it says recreation areas shall be provided at a rate of 250 square feet per bedroom. Now that recreation area can consist of open space, outdoor passive and active recreation areas, or indoor amenity spaces, or any combination thereof based on the character of the underlying property and the anticipated needs of the prospective tenants. Again, there's flexibility built into this regulation. The days of just putting up buildings with units and a parking lot, those are over. All projects now should have some kind of amenity space. And it really depends on who the target tenant is and what the property is itself. A property that's out quite a ways from other uses, property that has significant natural features, the recreation space may be suitable to provide it all as open space, passive walking trails, picnic areas, vistas. You may have projects that are more central to town, where they don't have those large open spaces that are suitable for that, and maybe there you want a fitness center, or maybe a community room and a pool. What it does is allows a developer to propose and be flexible. At the end of the day, they still have to provide the same amenity space, but they can meet that requirement in a lot of different ways based on the character of the property and what they think their tenant mix is going to be. Certainly, we've noticed, in some of the development I do, fitness centers are becoming more and more popular. But you don't put a rock wall in an elderly, climbing wall in a senior living project. That doesn't make sense. But if your target is younger people, having fire pits and a climbing wall might be exactly the type of space that makes sense for that development. So I think it's flexible. It allows for a lot of variability in projects, which is good too. Subsection H, buildings shall be located at least 50 feet from all property lines and streets, provided that access is provided as necessary for emergency vehicles. This is a minimum buffer that is required as setback off all property lines. It's consistent with other setbacks and other regulations or provisions that you have in your code. Again, you have to have at least this minimum setback for buildings. And sort of along the same lines in section I, we say that the perimeter of the site adjoining other properties with single-family residences shall be planted and maintained with shrubs or trees sufficiently dense to provide privacy for present or potential residents on both sides of the buffer. Such buffers or trees or shrubs shall at least be 6 feet in height at the time of planting. Existing wooded areas may satisfy this requirement, and the Commission may also approve alternative screening options which can provide comparable benefits. So one of the things we talked about, particularly with town staff, is there are times where you have adjacent land uses that may be incompatible with multifamily residential development, particularly in a strictly single-family neighborhood where you have houses close to the property line. It's not enough just to say a 50-foot setback. You need to provide privacy screening, a visual buffer to those properties. So this section specifically deals with when you have single-family residences next to a proposed development site. That might not be required, for example, in a commercial zone where you may have a multifamily development next to a commercial parking lot. You may not need a buffer, or the buffer might be much less. It also provides the flexibility. Sometimes planting trees isn't the best solution. Sometimes it's a privacy fence. Sometimes it's a berm. I'm doing a project at Waterford right now that we're putting a berm all along the frontage of the property to provide a different type of screening rather than just planting. This regulation allows that level of flexibility within the Commission's discretion. And finally, we have subsection J. And I'm not going to read all of subsection J because it's pretty lengthy. But what I've tried to do is provide some very basic architectural standards. This is not something that's typically in your regulations. You don't have a lot of quote-unquote architectural standards. Mr. Brace asked me to try to provide some generic ones. But effectively, I break the architectural standards up into 4 different categories. The first is trying to create buildings, materials, and architectural details, particularly on their primary facade. So that's the front of the building. Trying to create a pedestrian-friendly environment. So trying to take some time to actually care about what the building looks like and how it interacts with people coming and going into it. The second standard is about building mass and scale. It's about breaking up the buildings. The idea is we shouldn't be building just large, featureless boxes, but creating some articulation on the front, some different unusual shapes, shadow lines, the ability to put architectural details on to really give some architectural appearance to the buildings. Again, we're not looking to warehouse people in big boxes. We're looking to try to build beautiful living arrangements for people that want multifamily housing. 3, we talk a little bit about exterior materials that can be used. Ideally, the point here is to try to allow for flexibility, but also give the Commission discretion to say, hey, listen, that material is inappropriate at this location, but it might be appropriate over at this site. 4 is about roof forms. This is often a big issue in my experience, especially in Eastern Connecticut. We want to make sure that we protect, the visual appearance of roof forms. And a lot of times people put equipment on the roofs, whether they're rooftop heating and cooling units, making sure that those are properly shielded so that they don't have a negative impact on aesthetics or potentially even neighbors that are nearby. Again, these architectural standards are pretty basic, but again, it's enough to give the commission some teeth when they review an application to be able to point to it and say, hey, you've got to address this issue. And that was what our intent was through this, and I think it was a really good suggestion from Mr. Graves to add it. So, with that completes the bulk of my presentation tonight. Just to summarize, we believe the text amendment we put together was worked on for quite a few months. It's been carefully tailored to expand the opportunities for multifamily housing in Plainfield. But I think we've done it in a thoughtful way to try to make sure it's not available on every property in town. In fact, it's a very small subsample of those properties. And we're also giving the commission the controls through the 12.47 regulation to make sure that at the end of the day, that project fits into the fabric of the surrounding neighborhood. And through their special permit process, which is laid out in your regulations, while you don't have ultimate discretion, it's not unfettered discretion, you have much more discretion in a special permit than you do, for instance, in a site plan. And so we think that the special permit level of review is appropriate for this type of a use. So I'm available if you have any other questions about the proposal this evening, and certainly appreciate any comments or other suggestions you have. Thank you for your time.
Public hearing. So this is your opportunity as a member of the public to ask a question or make a comment on this application. Is there anyone in the public who has a comment or question?
Art Gagnon, Central Village. First, I'd like to say in the letter that I wrote to you last year, I did express an interest in multifamily housing, and I'm glad he brought this forward, and I like what he has to say. I do have a few questions about parking. I know when you did the ADUs, we required 2 parking spots per ADU. Didn't matter if it was studio, 1 bedroom, or whatever. I just wanted to put that up there. I want to ask if there'd be any percentage of affordable housing in these regulations to satisfy our state's mandated plan for affordable housing.
It's not included in the text amendment they submitted.
Right. I'm just bringing that to you, as a point of concern for me, because the more housing we put in, if it's not affordable, then we're going to be lowering our percentage of affordable housing. And then the other one was, he mentioned how many units you could actually put on. It differs. So I'd like to, ask to him how many units you could prospectively get on a 10-acre lot with the recreation area and so on.
Okay, thank you. And that actually leads into the question I had, because you mentioned no density requirements, but obviously with some of the setbacks and building requirements and height, it doesn't list a number of units. So the limiting factors would be the setbacks and how many buildings you could fit, plus the recreation area and how that would accommodate. So essentially, each application would have to kind of look at the size and shape of the property, and then that calculation would be done at the time of the presentation of the special permit. Am I right about that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's exactly it. And you can imagine that just the shape of a lot, as opposed to like a rectangular or square lot, as opposed to a lot that maybe have an unusual shape, could drastically change the number. The only other thing I would say is, in addition to the requirements for recreation and open space, there are a couple other requirements. So obviously, there is also the requirement of parking spaces, so you've got to be able to meet the parking space requirement. There's also the requirement of height, so you can't go up infinitely. So if you take the setbacks, you take the recreation space, you take the parking, you create a three stories of residential. There are also, while it's not in here, there are building and fire code requirements for minimum size for bedrooms, so that it really does back into it. But I think, to answer your question directly, and I think you alluded to it, any proposal under this would have to justify the number of units it's proposing by showing that it's in compliance with all other bulk and dimensional requirements of the regulations.
So the regulation is not setting a density, but the application, based on the dimensions, the measurements, and the requirements on their plan would be required to indicate how many units there would be maximally allowed on that property.
Absolutely. And that's a requirement, I think, in your site plan requirements, you have a requirement to show floor plans for buildings, and that would be shown on that, so absolutely.
Okay.
And I would say that this idea of not having arbitrary, what I call arbitrary density requirements, is relatively new. I just worked in the town of Ledyard, which approved in September a very similar regulation that allows multifamily in basically every zone in town now as a special permit in an effort to create housing opportunities. And they've ultimately, that commission made the same decision that we're asking you to make, is that making arbitrary rulings on density doesn't make sense. Show us that it's a good project and it meets all these other requirements, and show us and justify the number that way. And I could answer the other gentleman's comments, questions, whether now or at the...
No, go ahead, you can go ahead
Sure.
and address that.
So he did mention that in your ADU regulations that you require 2 units, 2 parking spaces per unit regardless of the number of bedrooms. And Mr. Brace had indicated that to us in one of our preliminary meetings. I stand by the argument that studies and in my experience in development is that 1 bedroom and particularly efficiency units or studio units, however you call them, don't require that level of parking. In general, in Connecticut, most multifamily projects that are being built right now are efficiency 1 and 2 bedroom units. Very few, if any, developers are building 3 unit new multifamily. And in terms of 4 unit or more, that just doesn't get built anymore. It just doesn't happen. And what we're seeing across the board is we're seeing a parking, what we call utilization rate of about 1.3 spaces per unit in these mixed projects. So when you have 1 and 2 bedroom units together, the general project parking demand that's observed after it's built is about 1.33 parking spaces. So in a 1 and 2 bedroom and efficiency mix, that's basically the unit count. If you have a 1 and 2 bedroom mixed use project, the parking calculations that we're going to give you generally are going to come out right in that 1.25 to 1.5 parking spaces, which is right in the sweet spot. Remember also from a parking perspective, no matter what you require from a zoning perspective, the ultimate developer has to actually rent these units. And so there's what I call the operational parking requirement. So regardless of what the town might say, to rent these units effectively, they have to have sufficient parking. And I would submit that major developers, the kind of developers I work with, they know exactly how many parking spaces they need to satisfy their residents. And it's right in that sweet spot of about 1.3 to 1.4 parking spaces. So I think our count is, our proposal is proper, but I would remind the commission, in your power, in your legislative capacity, you have 3 things you can do with this regulation. You can approve it as I've presented it. You can deny it and tell me to go home, and that's okay too. But you can also modify it. So if you think at the end of the day, you say, Attorney Sweeney, I think you have a great regulation, but I think you missed the mark on something, you can change that in your motion to approve as long as it doesn't materially impact the regulation. As long as it doesn't materially impact. If you turn this regulation into a regulation about glue factories, that would be a material change. But if you change the parking standard because you felt that it needed to be modified, or if you changed the setback a little bit because you think it was too little or too much, you're empowered by state law to do that. I just want to make sure that that's clear. Finally, just on the issue of affordability, we did not propose an affordable requirement. That wouldn't preclude somebody from proposing it. In our discussions with town officials, the desired need that was voiced to us was market rate, attainably priced housing. which doesn't have rent controls on it. Now, I understand and I respect, I'm working on an affordable project right now in Stonington. I understand the need desperately throughout the whole state, throughout the whole country for affordable housing. That's not the proposal we put before you, but if somebody came to you and wanted to do a project with affordable component, nothing in this regulation would prohibit them from doing it. If they wanted to do 5%, 10%, 20%, I've seen some towns ask for, so they sort of get ahead on the 10% DECD target. That's all things that you could ask a developer to consider through the process. So, thank you.
Stay right there.
Sure.
You mentioned in your presentation that you had done a review of properties that would fit these regulations.
Yep.
And I assume when you did that evaluation that you found that there were eligible properties in the RA 60, RA 40, RA 30, R19, and commercial districts. Now, staff had provided a map with some of that, but I'd be curious, do you have your map to present to show the eligible properties and what their current zoning is?
No, I don't have a map ready to present it as an exhibit today. I understood that Mr. Bryce had done a map, and we had looked at a map together collectively on that issue. But I think the map that he's prepared is relatively accurate.
Is reflective of the review that you did?
I do.
Okay.
And you'll see that it's not a significant number. I would point out, though, that, and this doesn't help my argument, but just remember that people can combine properties. So if you had 2 5-acre parcels that are not eligible now, you could put them together and make them eligible. Likewise, you may not have sewer and water to a part of town right now, but if you extended sewer and water along a state highway to that property, it could become eligible. So I would not say that the current map is accurate to all the potential possibilities. It's sort of a generalized understanding of what could be possible.
Ryan, since you did this one, of the properties that you outlined here, could you identify which ones, what their current zoning is? And if not tonight, then I would suggest having that for next meeting for review by the board members, to give them a better idea of how the regulation would impact properties in each of the individual zones. And whether, because as he said, he kind of stole my thunder there, as a board, these are our regulations to change. So we do not have to take regulations from a developer as is. We can modify and change. So for example, if you looked at the applicable zones and determined that you didn't feel that part of the regulation would be appropriate for a particular zone, you could strike that zone from the eligible zone for the regulation. So just an item for consideration. Also, in looking at where the regulations allow for 3 stories, so when we're talking about the heights.
Yep.
Looking at the current zones, I don't believe any of the residential zones currently allow 3-story, do they, Ryan?
No, 30-foot, well, 30-foot max.
So it's based on height, not floor.
Right.
So for example, if one of the floors was, let's just say, halfway underground, and they could still meet the height restriction of the underlying zone.
Right. So this regulation would bypass the maximum height requirements.
So in essence, if you have a zone where every residential unit is 30 feet high, but this 3-story would bring these eligible special permits to a height, let's just say 50 feet high, then that would be allowable under the 3-story regulation, regardless of the heights of the other buildings in the current zone.
Right. And also our regulations allow for height to be increased based on how far away it is from the setback line. So in commercial zones, industrial zones, every 2 feet you move in off the setback line, you go up a foot in height.
Okay. Regulation, it talks about 3-story, but it doesn't talk about feet height.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. if I
Sure,
can address
please.
it. So, a couple things. One of the differences between different grades of multifamily residential is ceiling height. So, if you can imagine for a second, a 3-story building is not typically 30 feet tall because you want to have a ceiling height that's probably 9 to 10 feet minimum. If you have a 7 or 8 foot ceiling height, it feels very low and very cramped. So most higher end and quality, I would say market rate apartments, have ceiling heights 9 to 10 feet. Well, the face of the ceiling is not at the same elevation as the face of the floor on the next level. If you can imagine, like it's like a sandwich, there is a layer between each floor. So even if you had a flat roofed building, you would have, and let's say we took 10-foot height ceilings, which is what you really like to have in a multifamily, to have some airiness, openness, and then you had a 2-foot sort of crawl area between the floors. That's where you put your electrical, your plumbing, your ducting. That's 12 feet per story to get up. You're at 36 feet for 3 stories just there. In addition, in my opinion at least, sometimes flat roofs can be beautiful and they can work with the design. But particularly in New England, a lot of towns want to see more New England shaped styles in roof lines. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the architectural standards. So you want to have pitches on the roof. You want to have dormers on the roof. You don't want to necessarily force a developer to do a flat roof just to meet a height requirement. So the idea of the 3 stories and not sticking to a specific height was to allow for that higher ceilings, to allow for the chases basically between the floors, and then allow for some roof lines that were different. It would not be unusual, quite frankly, that you might have a 3-story building, 3 stories that if you measured from top of ridge to average grade, you could be in the 40 to 50 foot zone. Absolutely. And I think you get that in a lot of more architecturally pleasing designs. That was our proposal. We certainly could consider, and you could consider, a modification to the regulation to say 3 stories or X number of feet. So you could have an either or. So, in that situation, I certainly would encourage you not to do 3 stories or 30 feet because it's going to be 30 feet every single time in that situation. But 3 stories or 45 feet might be something that we could work with. And so again, it's something certainly for discussion internally. We think that from a perspective of impact to adjacent properties, the required setback, plus if you're next to a single-family property, the requirement for screening and buffering for privacy, I think ameliorates that issue and minimizes potential conflict. But certainly a fair comment from the chairwoman, and certainly we'd be willing to work with you on anything along those lines.
Yeah, please.
This kind of pertains to the same issue as subsection E of 12.47. Just so I understand this, it said notwithstanding the maximum height provisions, the building shall exceed 2 stories exclusive of ground level subsurface parking. So I'm just thinking if you had parking at ground level and then had 3 stories on top of that,
It could be a 4-level, theoretically a 4-level building. And our thought process behind that was the advantages of having structured parking under a property in terms of the overall value of the project, convenience and safety of residents, and reduction in overall impervious surface. We weighed that out and we felt that it was more valuable to allow that than to worry about a 3-story maximum. Technically, you could do 4 stories in that situation. I don't think it's possible, but we also allow for subsurface parking. So you could have 3 levels of residential with a sort of a basement garage situation. That might work on certain properties where topography allows for that. In general, I haven't seen that successful except in really highly urbanized environments. I just don't think that that's probably likely in Plainfield. Well, we do have that worked in if you had that sort of unique site that would accommodate it.
Any other comments or questions from the public?
Can I do it from here?
Yeah, speak loud.
Okay. The height requirement, will this affect the fire apparatus? My name is Art Gaddy again. Would that affect the fire apparatus going over 30 feet?
We would be allowing the fire chief to review it. If the fire chief believes that it exceeded the height that their aerial ladder had the capacity to reach, that would be taken into consideration.
Okay. The other thing was, I don't see anything in the regulations, proposed regulations, about market price. Could these regulations be put towards low-income housing if somebody proposed it?
He did answer that it could be affordable housing.
Okay, is that affordable or low-income? I don't know the difference.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a little bit issue on height and firefighting apparatus. Mr. Bryce's response was perfect. But in addition, based on the building code and the classification of building construction, many buildings that are higher, sort of in the 3-story range, may actually require sprinkler systems as well. So that would be, and because there's public water, there may need to be booster pumps for that, but that's part of sort of the building and fire code review that would take place during an application to the town. On the issue of affordable housing, and the developer can, without the permission of this board, voluntarily decide to restrict its property for affordable or lower income people. That's not something the town has any control over. I think what's important to realize is if the town's overall housing stock is if less than 10% of that meets the state of Connecticut's affordable standard, it is subject to what we call Section 8-30G, or the Affordable Housing Appeals Act legislation. And in that situation, if you're under the 10%, a developer can come in and take your regulation book and throw it at the wall and say, I'm just building it. I don't need to follow your regulations, I can do what I want, and it's really, it becomes, the burden comes on you to stop it. And there's only a couple of ways you can do that. That's not what we're proposing here. We're proposing a regulation that's going to bind a developer. This is not for affordable housing. I do affordable housing. I go into the town, and I usually try to do it in a friendly manner and say, listen, we're building this. I'd like to try to work with you, but this is a different animal altogether. We're trying to do market rate here. We want to be subject to your review, to your comment, to your modifications. We're not trying to force anything down anybody's throat. But I know in many towns now, I'm doing a project in Marlborough right now. It is not an affordable housing project. We've got 60-something units of multifamily housing, and the town said, we're really worried about our percentage. We're really, really low. We're one of the lowest in the state. Would you mind doing 20% of your units as affordable? And we said, yeah, we can work with you on that. We'll do that, because that helps the town get closer to being exempt from that. It gets the town closer to being able to say to a developer who comes in and tries to shove it down their throat, no, 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 you have to follow our regulations. So, again, we haven't worked affordable housing into this proposal because our discussions with town officials was the need is market rate, attainably and fairly priced housing, but that's the real need in this community right now. Thank you.
This is a public hearing.
And then the other one that really didn't get answered, I was just looking for like an average number of units that would go on, say an ideal 10-acre lot, just so they have an idea of what would go on.
Have you done any of those calculations of what a range?
What would
in
fit on
acres
there?
would be?
30 units, 40?
Well, on 10 acres, I mean, it would be much more than that. It would be a couple hundred units at least on 10 acres of land.
Because it,
Thank you.
once again, depends on the shape of
It does, but I've done enough projects.
and whether you're doing the 3-story.
Yeah, I've done enough projects. I mean, I'll give you an idea. I've done 150 units on 2 acres in the middle of the city. So, but, on 10 acres, could you do but it doesn't have all the other requirements that we're requiring here. So could you do 200, 300 units on 10 acres? Absolutely. For the right piece, and where it makes sense, you could do that. Yep.
Any other comments or questions from the public? Any other comments or questions from board members? Okay, I'm going to ask the board to consider continuing this public hearing until January. I would like to see the map identifying the zones where the possible eligible properties would exist to give board members a better idea of the locations. I also would like for those areas to see what maximum heights of buildings are in those areas, because as we talked about, when you're talking 3-story, you're not talking about a specific height. It could vary and be as tall as 50, or even if it becomes that 4th, as the parking wouldn't count as one of the 3 stories, it could be even taller. So considering the surrounding character and area. I would also suggest members look at the current RA 60, 40, 30, 19 commercial districts to see how these regulations fit with the special permitted uses in those districts, and also to look at the criteria of a special permit application, because these regulations also have to have another criteria that we have to look at. So sometimes when you're looking at one part of a regulation, you might be saying, well, does it require X, Y, Z? That's in a different part of our regulations. So I would just suggest for a January meeting that everyone look at that so we can ensure consistency. And then I believe in the special permit, the sewer review would be done, right, Brian, about sewer capacity? Because obviously if a proposal came forward with, let's just say 100 units, and although a hookup could be allowed, but the capacity would not be sufficient to support those units, that is part of the special permit criteria.
Right, well, anytime there's a major project, the sewer department does review it.
Yeah. So that's what I mean about looking at the other part of the special permit regulations, because something that might not be clearly in this part of the regulation is addressed in the special permit application. So those were the things I would like to see. I also am leaning more towards having a hard height restriction rather than the third story. So I would be looking perhaps for staff to advise on what a hard height restriction would be, rather than allowing the flexibility to be anywhere from 45 to 60 feet tall.
I actually had a thought on that.
Sure.
Utilizing our current regulations. So maybe max height of, say, 40 feet, and then if you want to go higher than that, you have to come in at least 2 feet off of the setback for every 1 foot vertical.
Okay. So if we could have that suggested language for the next public hearing, did board members have any other items that they would want reviewed, addressed, or ready for next meeting? And would applicant have any items that they feel need more clarity?
No, Madam Chairman, as usual, you're right to the point and very efficient. I just want to make it clear, I always want to make sure that I deliver what I'm asked to. So you asked for an updated map of the areas. That's his product, so.
And I wasn't looking at a parcel that met the description of 10 acres. I looked at vacant areas that combined would be at least 10 acres. So
And you know, there are a lot of like sort of questions, like for instance, if you came across a property that met all the requirements, but it's fully developed. You know, it's the, I'm thinking off the top of my head, like it's the Bacchus Emergency Center property.
Sure.
Would that property be on your map or not? And I would think the answer is no. If you're really
Because
looking,
it's fully developed, you're not going to bulldoze it to make this.
I mean, you could, but the likelihood of that is very low.
Right.
So I'm happy to work with Mr. Brace. It's, I just don't want him to have all of the burden. It's my application. I'm happy to work with him. I have a really good working relationship with him. It sounds to me if we can get you a map that shows you the possible areas with the possible sites, clarify the heights that are in those areas, and then maybe draft a modified Section E that would address the hard stop. And I thought Mr. Brace's suggestion is brilliant, that doesn't lock us in. If we have a really creative building that's beautiful, that's the worst possible scenario when a developer has a vision for something, comes in and everybody goes, that's gorgeous, but you can't do it because the regulation just arbitrarily says no. But if it gave us the ability to shift the building back or move it away from a property line and still achieve it, that's exactly the kind of flexibility we're looking for.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. So yeah, if you could work on that for our next meeting, that would be what I would be looking for.
Terrific. Thank you for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
So any other comments, questions from staff or board members? Okay, I'll entertain a motion to continue the public hearing. Motion by Roz, second by John. All in favor of continuing to our next regularly scheduled meeting, January 10th, 2023, 7 p.m.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Public hearing continued to next month. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to item B, 22-9ZC